times and in all countries must please. Supposing, therefore, that Victoria herself was in favour of the marriage, the further question arose as to whether Albert's mental qualities were such as to fit him for the position of husband of the Queen of England. On this point, continued the Baron, one heard much to his credit. The Prince was said to be discreet and intelligent. But all such judgments were necessarily partial, and the Baron preferred to reserve his opinion until he could come to a trustworthy conclusion from personal observation. And then he added, "But all this is not enough. The young man ought to have not merely great ability, but a right ambition and a great force of will as well. To pursue for a lifetime a political career so arduous demands more than energy and inclination. It demands also that earnest frame of mind which is ready of its own accord to sacrifice mere pleasure to real usefulness. If he is not satisfied hereafter with the consciousness of having achieved one of the most influential positions in Europe, how often will he feel tempted to repent his adventure? If he does not from the very outset accept it as a vocation of grave responsibility, on the efficient performance of which his honour and happiness depend, there is small likelihood of his succeeding." Such were the views of Stockmar on the qualifications necessary for the due fulfilment of that destiny which Albert's family had marked out for him; and he hoped, during the tour in Italy, to come to some conclusion as to how far the Prince possessed them. Albert, on his side, was much impressed by the Baron, whom he had previously seen but rarely. He also became acquainted for the first time in his life with a young Englishman, Lieutenant Francis Seymour, who had been engaged to accompany him, whom he found sehr liebenswürdig, and with whom he struck up a warm friendship. He delighted in the galleries and scenery of Florence, though with Rome he was less impressed. "But for some beautiful palaces," he said, "it might just as well be any town in Germany." In an interview with Pope Gregory XVI he took the opportunity of displaying his erudition. When the Pope observed that the Greeks had taken their art from the Etruscans, Albert replied that, on the contrary, in his opinion, they had borrowed from the Egyptians. His Holiness politely acquiesced. Wherever he went he was eager to increase his knowledge, and at a ball in Florence he was observed paying no attention whatever to the ladies, and deep in conversation with the learned Signor Capponi. "Voilà un prince dont nous pouvons être fiers," said the Grand Duke of Tuscany, who was standing by. "La belle danseuse l'attend, le savant l'occupe." On his return to Germany, Stockmar's observations, imparted to King Leopold, were still critical. Albert, he said, was intelligent, kind, and amiable. He was full of the best intentions and the noblest resolutions, and his judgment was in many things beyond his years. But great exertion was repugnant to him. He seemed to be too willing to spare himself, and his good resolutions too often came to nothing. It was particularly unfortunate that he took not the slightest interest in politics, and never read a newspaper. In his manners, too, there was still room for improvement. "He will always," said the Baron, "have more success with men than with women, in whose society he shows too little empressement, and is too indifferent and retiring." One other feature of the case was noted by the keen eye of the old physician. The Prince's constitution was not a strong one. Yet, on the whole, he was favourable to the projected marriage. But by now the chief obstacle seemed to lie in another quarter. Victoria was apparently determined to commit herself to nothing. And so it happened that when Albert went to England he had made up his mind to withdraw entirely from the affair. Nothing would induce him, he confessed to a friend, to be kept vaguely waiting. He would break it off at once. His reception at Windsor threw an entirely new light upon the situation. The wheel of fortune turned with a sudden rapidity, and he found in the arms of Victoria the irrevocable assurance of his overwhelming fate. 2. He was not in love with her. Affection, gratitude, the natural reactions to the unqualified devotion of a lively young cousin who was also a queen, such feelings possessed him, but the ardours of reciprocal passion were not his. Though he found that he liked Victoria very much, what immediately interested him in his curious position was less her than himself. Dazzled and delighted, riding, dancing, singing, laughing amid the splendours of Windsor, he was aware of a new sensation, the stirrings of ambition in his breast. His place would indeed be a high, an enviable one. And then, on the instant, came another thought. The teaching of religion, the admonitions of Stockmar, his own inmost convictions, all spoke with the same utterance. He would not be there to please himself, but for a very different purpose, to do good. He must be noble, manly, and princely in all things. He would have to live and to sacrifice himself for the benefit of his new country, to use his powers and endeavours for a great object, that of promoting the welfare of multitudes of his fellow men. One serious thought led on to another. The wealth and bustle of the English court might be delightful for the moment, but after all it was Coburg that had his heart. "While I shall be untiring," he wrote to his grandmother, "in my efforts and labours for the country to which I shall in future belong, and where I am called to so high a position, I shall never cease ein treuer Deutscher, Coburger, Gothaner zu sein." And now he must part from Coburg for ever. Sobered and sad, he sought relief in his brother Ernest's company. The two young men would shut themselves up together, and, sitting down at the pianoforte, would escape from the present and the future in the sweet, familiar gaiety of a Haydn duet. They returned to Germany, and while Albert for a few farewell months enjoyed for the last time the happiness of home, Victoria for the last time resumed her old life in London and Windsor. She corresponded daily with her future husband in a mingled flow of German and English, but the accustomed routine reasserted itself. The business and the pleasures of the day would brook no interruption. Lord M. was once more constantly beside her, and the Tories were intolerable as ever. Indeed, they were more so, for now, in these final moments, the old feud burst out with redoubled fury. The impetuous sovereign found, to her chagrin, that there might be disadvantages in being the declared enemy of one of the great parties in the state. On two occasions the Tories directly thwarted her in a matter on which she had set her heart. She wished her husband's rank to be fixed by statute, and their opposition prevented it. She wished her husband to receive a settlement from the nation of £50,000 a year, and again, owing to the Tories, he was only allowed £30,000. It was too bad. When the question was discussed in Parliament, it had been pointed out that the bulk of the population was suffering from great poverty, and that £30,000 was the whole revenue of Coburg. But her uncle Leopold had been given £50,000, and it would be monstrous to give Albert less. Sir Robert Peel, it might have been expected, had had the effrontery to speak and vote for the smaller sum. She was very angry, and determined to revenge herself by omitting to invite a single Tory to her wedding. She would make an exception in favour of old Lord Liverpool, but even the Duke of Wellington she refused to ask. When it was represented to her that it would amount to a national scandal if the Duke were absent from her wedding, she was angrier than ever. "What, that old rebel? I won't have him," she was reported to have said. Eventually she was induced to send him an invitation, but she made no attempt to conceal the bitterness of her feelings, and the Duke himself was only too well aware of all that had passed. Nor was it only against the Tories that her irritation rose. As the time for her wedding approached, her temper grew steadily sharper and more arbitrary. Queen Adelaide annoyed her. King Leopold, too, was ungracious in his correspondence.